Thomas kept tinkering with his lineup, finally settling on Sam Scott at center, Harold Stanley and Nip Drumheller at forward, and Bob Turner at point guard, a continuation of his role as the quarterback on the football team. Fred Stanley, although the tallest player on the team, was the other guard, so that he had room from which to launch that devastating hook shot. Through January and early February, the Winds began to come over teams that had feasted on them in previous years. They beat Manaway Village by 25 points, Shalersville by 14, Manaway Township by 24, Troy by 30, Garrettsville by 10. There were no superstars. Fred Stanley had the most points in any game, and that was only 12. By the end of the county regular season, they had a 5-3 league record. Not spectacular, but solidly in the middle of the race. But in 1940, the 19-team Portage County Conference had a league tournament at the end of the season. Now this tournament was to determine the 5 teams that would qualify for the B, or small school sectional tournament at Kent State University. Played on an 84 by 50-foot court that was half again as big as Windham's gym. Today, every team in Ohio gets to play in sectional tournaments. It wasn't that way 70 years ago. But the Bombers had to open against the Hiram Huskies, the regular season leader who had beaten them earlier in the season on the first day of the tournament. That first day of the tournament featured 8 games in 12 hours. Now this time Coach Thomas emphasized defense, and his Bombers responded by giving up only 7 field goals the entire game, not fouling anyone and squeaking by 18-15. This set up a quarterfinals game on a Thursday afternoon against Freedom, which had also defeated Windham a month earlier. And if they won that game, they would have to play again that same evening. Once more, Dave Thomas rejiggered his lineup. He moved Harold Stanley to center, Sam Scott to guard, and Fred Stanley to left forward. And Fred responded with a breakout game. He made almost as many field goals himself, 8, as the entire Freedom team made. And the Bombers won 34-23. After 1 hour rest, they again took the Kent State University floor against Edinburgh, whom they had not played in the regular season. Now, against the scrappy Scots, who didn't have a single player taller than 5'8", Thomas again emphasized tight man-to-man defense. And this time his boys gave up only 6 field goals in 4 quarters. A 25-16 win sent them into the championship game against defending league champion Suffield, who had been crushing teams by over 40 points a game during that tournament. Oliver Wolcott, the longtime Ravenna newspaper sports writer, said that Windham had been the dark horse since the beginning of the tournament, which made the performance of the Bombers totally unexpected. Thomas sent his boys into a stalling game, completely nullifying the high-powered Red Devils shooters and resulting in a lead of 4-1 at the end of the first quarter and 8-6 after the second. At halftime, Thomas told his boys to start feeding Fred Stanley under the basket, and Sam Scott made that his mission. Stanley scored 9 points, the defense remained stifling, and at the end of that 27-19 victory, the 1940 Windham Bombers stood on top of the Portage County Conference with the first championship trophy that Windham's boys had ever won on a basketball court. And they qualified for the sectional tournament for the very first time. Now that trophy that they won is sitting on that table over there. It's the one on the far left. That is the oldest basketball trophy in the Windham Trophy case. Now, the sectional tournament, it was their misfortune to draw Waynesburg, a Stark County squad that had lost only 2 games all the entire season. And one of those was the defending state champion North Canton Vikings. The game was a classic struggle, and the two teams were tied 26-26 with 2 minutes left. Waynesburg made the final 2 shots and left the floor as victors, the first step into what would eventually lead them to the state finals that year. But Oliver Wolcott, the sports writer, was duly impressed with the young Bombers. In his write-up of that game, Wolcott said it was only due to playing on the larger Kent State floor that tired Windham out. Remember, they were playing their 5th game in 6 days on a full-sized court. And he closed the article by saying that the success of the underrated Bombers was due in no small part to Dave Thomas, their coach. Now, the months leading up to the following basketball season had to be the most exciting period that the sleepy little town of Windham had ever experienced. The Windham Bombers 6-man football team returned from Niagara Falls, Canada with an international championship to their name. The first draft numbers were drawn as America began to ramp up for another world war. The federal government confiscated half of Windham Township, and the building of the Ravenna Arsenal became a 24-hour-a-day beehive. Dave Thomas lost Nick Drumco under graduation and Sam Scott to the Armed Services, but he still had the Stanley boys and Bob Turner to build his squad around. Long-distance shooter Bob Fector, who replaced Scott, had been his 6th man the previous year. Tiny Don Miller had been varsity the entire season, and he moved up football players Frank Janicek, Harold Belden, Con Thrasher, and Bob Goss from the JV team. He added the football team manager, Bob Tadlick, for good measure. Tadlick never got into a game, so I don't know whether he was a manager or a player. Now, Oliver Wolcott wrote that Thomas would have to rely on speed and clever ball handling, but he didn't feel that the team had the height to compete in the Portage County Conference that year. Well, the first game of the 1940-41 season was a road trip to Nelson, which had the most universally loathed gym in the county. Nelson played on a floor in the big white building that still sits up there on Nelson Circle. It had seating only on a balcony that overhung the court itself, making it impossible to shoot from anywhere except directly in front of the basket. But that didn't matter to Bob Fector, who wore such thick glasses that he had to smell the basket rather than actually see it. Fector played the game of his life, draining 8 long shots for 16 points in a 37-5 win that put the league on notice that the boys from Windham had found a second sport that they loved. Fred Stanley scored only 3 goals in that Nelson game. So no one in the league knew the whirlwind that Dave Thomas had prepared to unleash. Fred Stanley had become a scoring machine. The Bombers began a march through the county as devastating as Sherman had unleashed on Georgia, with Fred averaging over 20 points a game, unheard of in those days. And Thomas's stifling press, often stealing the ball before the other team could even reach half court, the victory margins began to mount. Undefeated Streetsboro fell. Undefeated Hiram was next. When the Paris Night Riders came to town, featuring a nasty junior gunner named Jim Purdy, they were able to manage only 7 measly points. And still the Bombers rolled on. They whipped Manaway Township 51-14, with Fred scoring 34 points, a Windham scoring record that stood for over a decade. Aurora was shellacked 53-13. The other coaches around the league began to complain publicly that Dave Thomas and his boys were running up the score to humiliate their opponents. Well, that was the last thing Dave Thomas would ever do. And a Ravenna newspaper even wrote an editorial telling the whiners how wrong they were. Oliver Wolcott compared Dean Everbond to Dave Thomas with these words: